Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for the Being Libertarian family of publications, which includes beinglibertarian.com, think-liberty.com, rationalstandard.com, and, of course, Champion Books. Something I found out the other day regarding Champion Books, just want to throw this out there as well, is that our inaugural book, Igniting Liberty, Voices for Freedom Around the World, you can actually read it for free if you have an Amazon Prime account or whatever associate account's required for Kindle there. You can actually read it for free there. As always, you can follow us on all forms of social media. You can follow myself directly on Facebook by searching Killian Hobbs Author. I'm getting really close to 800 followers. I was actually quite surprised how many people take the time out of their day or actually want to follow along with any of the silly memes or different posts that I put out or certain thoughts I might have or articles, podcasts, etc., etc. I was actually quite happy to see how quickly some of the people had come up to listen to some of the stuff or at least to see the kind of things that I have to say. So I definitely want to say thank you to everyone that's out there that does follow the page. And hopefully if you don't already, then hopefully you will. I think I said hopefully about 4 times there. I don't know why I get caught on these loops sometimes, but that's beside the point. You can listen to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, including one that will be on a bit of a different feed. It's the one that previous guest and the previous host of the main podcast, you could say, which is the Think Liberty podcast, Vinnie Marshall. He has a new show coming up called The Curious Task, so do make sure to take a look out there. The first episode is out. It also has a Facebook page that you can follow as well. Now, with all that, I guess you could call it house cleaning stuff kind of out of the way, I'm going to dive right into today's episode. The thing I wanted to discuss today was something that I've noticed in discourse in my time doing this. I know I say my time as if I'm some kind of older fellow when I'm really not, but, I've been in the online debate communities and talking to people and discussing philosophy, libertarianism, economics, practicalities in life, etc., etc. I've been doing this for a fair amount of time. I've started doing it quite, I guess you could say, officially, if you will, when I started up with Think Liberty back in tail end of June, may as well call it beginning of July. That's when I really started to, I guess, get my voice out there in a more prominent way. But I find that in the time I've done this, because before that I was a moderator or admin for a few different debate groups and would get brought in to discuss this, that, or the next thing, plus also was a bit of a touch point in real life for certain things as well, but that's neither here nor there. What I found in the time that I've been doing this is that the actual concept of philosophy itself has started to wane. What I mean here is that when it comes to philosophy, we don't really philosophize anymore. And I know that sounds very almost pedantic, I guess you could say. But I bring it up because it's such a strange yet obvious realization that I've come to have. I find that in our discourse or in our conversations that the actual philosophies and ideologies and things that are supposed to back up and explain the things that we believe or what we stand for, it's just not present in a lot of the conversations that we see people have. Now, this isn't to shame people who haven't read 1,000 books or anything like that. I definitely do recommend that if you're going to discuss politics or you're going to discuss economics or you're going to discuss philosophy or anything like that, that if there are associated reading materials, you do read through them. But at the same time, I find that a lot of people take these stances without really understanding them. Friedrich Nietzsche once said that God is dead and we killed him. Well, I'd like to say that philosophy is dead, and I'm going to explain why we killed it. The first reason that I think that, philosophy has kind of died, I guess you could say. And I say died loosely. I should clarify that. I don't think that philosophy is completely a dead and done school of thought. I think that it's something that still has weight, it still has value, it still has purpose. And I don't think that in truth it'll ever truly go away, but I would consider its death almost a practical death. So, like I said, the first reason that I think this has happened is primarily because it's left our discourse. We talk about things in a very caged way. So we talk about things specifically in the one issue we might be discussing. You don't see the depth in some of these conversations that there might have been 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago even, especially during certain peak periods of thought, such as the Renaissance or during the Industrial Revolution, when a whole bunch of new school philosophers came about. What I find is that, like, I'll use libertarian groups for an example, because that's probably what most of my audience here is most familiar with. In a lot of these groups, you'll see people talking about the concept of property and using homesteading rules and things like that, but they don't understand anything that Spooner might have had to say about it. They have heard the name Rothbard, but they haven't actually read any of the associated works or even passages of the associated works to get the argument that's being used. They just know that the argument exists, it fits with what they like to believe, and that's the thing they're going to go for. And you see this in the way that they argue for it. They'll try to put forward a strong argument to say, oh, this is the way that this is. And as soon as you just try to ask even a slight few questions, it all falls apart. They start giving you terrible example after terrible example, trying to prop everything up. I remember a personal experience on this one. I wrote an article on it too. Implicit contracts. Someone tried to use the argument of saving a person that was drowning at sea and bringing them on the boat, and how that somehow put you in a implicit contract that you couldn't kill them. And that was the reason why you couldn't kill them, was because you saved them. Now, as asinine of an argument as that is, because first off, a contract is an explicit agreement, whereas you can't have an implicit, explicit thing. It's an oxymoron. It's not something that can actually take place. That's the first part that steps out to me and just says, no, this is wrong. The other issue with it is that there's no connection there. There's no connection whatsoever. One of the most basic philosophical grad student things that anyone learns in the world of philosophy is some of the tools. Some of the very basic, straightforward, these are the bare bone, you must know these things in order to have a vague idea of how to debate or how to discuss these ideas. Things like Occam's razor, things like Hume's guillotine, or even Hitchens' razor, or different little short tools that can be used to discuss philosophy. But people will put forward these arguments thinking that they've got a great argument on their hands, and it's nothing. And then as soon as you point out how weak it is, or you even try to have a more good faith argument with them and say, okay, here's the things I'm seeing wrong with this. Maybe you can expand on it. Maybe you can tell me a little bit more about what you believe and what I'm getting wrong. As soon as you try to go down that route, the emotions come out. It stops being about the idea and it starts being about, oh, you know, you're an idiot, you're an asshole, you're this, you're that, you're the next thing. It stops being about the philosophy. It stops being about the ideas. And sure, we could chalk this up to, you know, the average person just not being even-tempered. Nobody's perfectly rational. Everybody has their hot button items, and nobody likes to be proven wrong. I discussed this, I think, again, in a previous podcast, where we have this issue of not wanting to be wrong, even if it means that the things that we're left believing are wrong. We have a confirmation bias there. I tie this back to the issue of philosophy, though, because if we can't discuss it, if we can't employ it, then it doesn't have any value left. I mean, if we make these different arguments, and as soon as someone challenges these arguments, we don't even defend them. We just start to jump into a whole bunch of random tangents. We go on, wild goose chases, or put up a bunch of red herrings, or start to attack the person themselves for even daring to question these things. Or worse, daring to have a different stance. When we start to do that, it completely eliminates any value that the arguments or ideas might have had, because we're not talking about the ideas anymore. At that point, it's just become personality versus personality, and the actual concepts at hand, the dialectics, the debate, the conversation around these things dies with it. Philosophy isn't just something that you find in musty tombs, or at least in my eyes, it's not something that you just read in books over and over. And I know I did mention that reading the books is important, but in order for the information to have any value, it has to be put to use. And the place that philosophy gets put to use is in those conversations. It's part of how we define our worldview and how we're going to act and react within the world. It's part of how we build a system of ethics for how we're going to treat and judge those around us. Who's worthy of help, who's not, what's right, what's wrong, and other quote-unquote spooky things, as some people would say. Trying to figure these things out is the core of philosophy. But in order to figure them out, we need to be able to discuss them, and discuss them even-headedly. We need to be able to test the ideas against each other, where it's just the ideas going against each other. And one of us is proven wrong. It doesn't mean that one of us is proven wrong. It means that we've thrown a bad idea out, and the two people that were participating or more can move forward with the right idea. Instead, we let it get personal, and we ruin a good chance to have a proper conversation on an idea because we let it be a personal thing. We'll try to say that a personal bias is an objective truth, and as soon as you start to question that, well, the results on that is basically a big old go fuck yourself. That's the response that you get out of it. You can go, if you go down the chain, you just go through each argument and work it down. Eventually it comes down to personal preferences and personal biases, and they don't want to admit that. And it's perfectly okay to say those things. Like, for example, a lot of the libertarian stances that most people have. If you boil it down, it all goes back to that initial goal. It goes back to that initial stance of, I don't like the government interfering with my life because I don't think they have a right to. And the reason I don't think they have a right to is because I would not have someone else interfering in my life if such an entity didn't exist. If I was out and away, these people wouldn't be forcing me to do things. So, even with them here, I shouldn't have another group of people forcing me to do things. I think that's wrong. And right there, I think it's wrong. It's a personal value statement. It's a personal preference. I would prefer not to have these things happen to me. Here's the reasons why I think that it's wrong and why it shouldn't happen. And other people might have different set of reasons. I mean, we see this with people who have, who believe that ends justify means, even though in philosophy you can see very thoroughly that no, they don't. A lot of politics is built on the concept that the ends do justify the means. Coercive force from the state is worth it because it lowers crime, supposedly, or at least curtails crime because there's that threat of force from police departments. Same thing with active military. Same thing with taxation in order to fund all of the different programs that the state does. All of it hinges on the concept that ends justify means, but we don't have that conversation anymore because we would have to explain all of the systems of logic that are related, and people would have to have a better concept of what these things are in order to have a meaningful conversation about it that doesn't simply boil down to, well, I think that's the way it is, so that's the way it's going to be. Our inability to discuss, I would say, is the chief reason that philosophy is effectively dead as far as general conversation is concerned. But let's move it up a step. Another reason that I think philosophy is on its death throes, or in its deathbed at least, is that when we look at how we discuss these things, even in a higher scale, you could say, so outside of the, quote unquote, two people at a coffee shop having a conversation kind of philosophy, which ironically is what this show is named after, when we see people trying to engage in a proper philosophical conversation, we see that they're already attached to certain schools. I would say one of the most fatal things that ever arose in philosophical discussion was the mind-body split. So we saw this with the rise of the empiricists versus the rationalists. The rationalists took the ideology that everything is in your mind and everything is created by your mind, or at least purely interpreted by the mind. And because of this, we can't work off of or truly trust just the physical responses of the world. Empirical data could be found to be wrong. I mean, there is value in that. We see this with advances in measuring equipment for scientific explorations. It changes the way that we see the universe, how the world works, things like that. And these were also, it should be kept in mind, these were a lot of ideas that came out back when scientific fields still incorporated philosophy into the way that they studied the world. Because there was time when the philosophies of the world and the different ideas and going through these things still held a real value that it just doesn't anymore outside of people who treat it as a thought exercise. I'd probably say maybe the rules of logic as far as them being transferred over to computing, and businesses that run off of ethics and try to have those debates so that they can have their own internal ethical code, or maybe even with legal systems we can see this. But outside of some of those things, again, it's on the practicality side. The application kind of falls short. But I'm sidetracking a little here. As I was saying, when it comes to empiricists and rationalists, we saw this with the mind-body split. I've already explained the rationalist side. Empiricists take the other view. They believe that your mind can visualize things that are false. I mean, hallucinogenic drugs exist, so there's some value to it. Your reality didn't change just because your brain is telling you you're seeing things that aren't there. Now, that's an abnormality, so we can't work purely off of that, but there's value in that, in saying that it's your physical senses in the physical or more material world that holds its real value. So trying to base things entirely off of the mind, it doesn't quite work. Because of this split, we see a whole bunch of subschools of thought break out from here. It got to the point where the most minor difference in thought would lead to believing in a completely different ideological school, in which case there was other subsets that had to be taken into account with that sub-school, and the books piled up and up and up. Even the most studious or intelligent of philosophy students could not realistically, even if they started at, late high school through college and made a life out of it, completely and utterly tell you everything related to even a singular philosophical issue. They couldn't tell you every angle or every approach or every counter or every system for it. They just couldn't. There's too many different arguments out there now for anyone to completely sift through all of them and actually reach some sort of conclusion. And again, that goes back to the discussion aspect and the practicality of it, so on and so forth, but I'm not going to sidetrack and repeat that again. What we need to look at now is, how do we fix that mind-body split? Immanuel Kant tried to do so with his various approaches. He tried to fix that split, but in doing so, he actually just made it wider. He tried to solidify a way to connect these two ideas, and it didn't work. I would say with his different systems, most famously the hypothetical categories and let's say hypothetical and categorical imperatives, where he tried to blend these concepts. He tried to blend the mind and the body and bring it back together. But we can see the result when we follow through on all the philosophers that came after him or quoted him or even referenced him slightly, that his work was interpreted very differently, and it led to an even larger split. I'm not a big fan of her, but you could almost give a little bit of congratulations to Ayn Rand for attempting to fix the mind-body split. I still say that she failed on that regard as well. And I know there's a lot of people that might be listening that might be fans of her that aren't going to necessarily enjoy me saying that she failed at something, but I would say that she didn't quite make the connection at least strong enough to hold up under serious arguments. If we really tried to take that down, I don't think that what she put out there would really hold water. But at least she saw that that was one of the major issues facing philosophy and attempted to fix it. Because without fixing that, we see the third problem that we have in philosophy. The third problem is that a lot of philosophy boils down to semantics now. One of the schools of philosophy, epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, seeing whether or not we can actually know things. So, for example, you can have moral epistemology. So, moral philosophy would be judging whether something is right or wrong, whereas moral epistemology is judging whether or not it is possible for us to know if something is right or wrong. Seems, again, like a pretty shallow separation, but on philosophical grounds, there is a very distinct reason for having that split. Because if we can't know if something is right or wrong, then it's hard for us to say that something is right or wrong. This whole school of thought, of epistemology, and trying to figure out what it is that we can actually know, it has a great importance. Unfortunately, we get back to the practicalities and the way that it's employed. It doesn't actually translate, at least in regular conversation or even in philosophical conversation outside of maybe the highest reaches of academia. It doesn't translate into anything useful or anything that's going to further a conversation. Instead, a lot of it comes down to semantic basis. For a lot of these types of conversations, if you're going to try to get somewhere with it with an opponent, let's say you find someone who holds different grounds than you, is willing to have a good faith conversation or a good faith debate on the topic, put the ideas against each other, and they're not looking to win so much as they're looking to test the arguments and the ideas and the points against each other so that both of you can walk away having reached something a little bit closer to what we could call a truth. Let's say by some miracle we come across another person like that, and both people are in a mindset or discussing a topic where they can both separate themselves from it and have that conversation. The first half of that conversation is going to be laying down what each word means. That's the problem that we run into. I mean, when we talk about a great libertarian concept, self-ownership, we run into the semantic debate with self-ownership because of a lot of the rules around ownership or a lot of the concepts of ownership. Because if we're defining ownership strictly as the ability to have complete mastery over it, then sure, the arguments for self-ownership work. But in order to own the self, if you're owning something, then usually that means that you and the thing you own are separate entities. Your property is not a physical extension of yourself. It is a separate thing that was unowned that you now own. So either we're talking about the self in a very metaphysical concept, in which case we're separating it from the body, which again, there's that mind-body split problem, or we're using the word ownership differently. And we need to think about the way that we're defining that word in order to see whether or not this holds up. The idea that a person has control over themselves or has mastery of what they do, what they think, I think that's something that most people can agree with, unless we get into the free will determinism debate, which is a completely different issue to the one we're discussing. But at that point, we have to say, well, what is control? Because that opens the door to the free will versus determinism debate. We have to say, okay, well, what is ownership? What is mastery? What is? And by trying to define these terms consistently and continuously, then we can reach something that might hold ground in an argument. But they only hold ground in an argument if we're using a very specific definition. When we try to broad scale some of these definitions, we run into some more issues. Another great example for this would be the view of property. When we look at property from a libertarian stance, or I guess a quote-unquote right-wing stance, or even a capitalistic sense, depending if they're more free market versus just state-enforced rights, if we look at property is something, or legitimate property ownership anyway, all property is private property. It's something that an individual owns, in which case government-owned property, the government is the quote-unquote individual in this regard that is owning property. They might be owning it on behalf of the general population, or at least as the claim, even though we know it's not exactly how it works out. They're still the entity that owns it. But then we look at what property is according to, say, communist philosophy, in which case the idea of private property is used exclusively in the terms of means of production almost. Property that you own that you are separate from or away from, i.e., a boss that owns a factory but doesn't stay there, a person that owns a house but doesn't live there, so on and so forth. It's property that you're not actually using. Whereas personal property covers everything else, your home, your car, your toothbrush, etc., etc. Right on that difference when the word property gets used, or even when the words private property gets used, we can see that in order for the arguments on either side to hold, or for there to be any kind of fruitful conversation about these two ideologies against each other, these terms would need to be defined, at least if we're going to discuss it on a philosophical ground instead of just comparing death stats or something equally morbid as that. Because it just turns into semantics and bullshit, a lot of people find themselves turned away from philosophy. It's not something that's worth getting into anymore, because if every third sentence is asking, well, what do you mean by this word? Or how is this word being used? Or even worse still, the arguments that boil down to, well, that word doesn't necessarily mean that. It could also mean this, and by this meaning, you're wrong. Well, that doesn't really do anything. It doesn't disprove a point. It doesn't further the conversation along. It nitpicks language. And again, there is a value to that. I'm not going to completely throw that away. We need to be able to communicate ideas clearly, concisely, and with a sense of finality to it. If we're using vague terminology, or at least unagreed upon terminology, to try to back up some of the things that we're saying, then we are, in effect, using a poor argument. We are violating different rules of philosophy. I mean, using poor semantics, there's about 3 or 4 different fallacies that come into play, especially if you're switching the meaning of terms or doing different things with the language where it just doesn't quite fit. Then yes, that needs to be called out and that needs to be corrected. But making the entire conversation about that's when everything falls apart. Another great example would be Jordan B. Peterson. Anytime he's asked a question, he always goes through with, well, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? Rather than being able to answer a question. Even something as simple as just pointing out, okay, your question's wrong because it doesn't include this, or it tries to trap, sort of like the Socratic method used to trap someone, where by acknowledging the question, it leads to having to pick between one or two things, but you're agreeing to an underlying premise. He could point those things out, but instead he just tries to clarify 7 different terms before actually getting around to answering a question. He's done that in several interviews that I've seen. Even though usually the joke of it is, well, what do by this you actually meant, which his opponents do a lot for some reason or another. But again, just to clarify that, he does that as well with trying to constantly define the terms and break every single question down to every single term. And that's a perfect example of the issues with going through the semantics on every single aspect of philosophy now. It's turned into word games and bullshit half the time. We've lost so much of what this supposed search for knowledge or love of knowledge is supposed to be, that it's turned into a tool, and not even all that useful of one, because we found better tools in the form of emotionalism, in the forms of basically just bad arguments and various fallacies that, frankly, most people just aren't equipped to deal with anymore. Or they're not putting on their thinking cap and saying, hey, wait a minute, the things you're saying right now, they don't hold up. And here's why they don't hold up. Because we don't put any kind of emphasis on the practicality side of philosophy anymore. I know I'm generalizing with this, and I do hope that I'm wrong. I would much prefer it if I was wrong in this sense. But from what I've seen, when we look at the actual applicative process and we look at the use we have left for philosophy and the way that it's gone, it diminishes as time progresses rather than increasing and expanding as it should as we add on to these things and get closer and closer to the point of philosophy, which is to uncover truths. Now, the last thing I'll say here, though, is that not all is lost. Like I said, to say that it's dead is a very questionable statement, I guess you could say. It's on his deathbed would probably be the best way to describe it. But the thing we can do to get away from that, to make philosophy have a point to it, to bring it back into our discourse, bring it back into our politics, actually understand it, actually understand where our opponents are coming from, be able to have these conversations and get somewhere, it has to start with knowledge. It has to start with understanding where these ideas came from, what they mean, who the people who came up with them were, and what they stood for, and trying to really close our minds around what these concepts, what some of these argumentative rules actually are. That way we don't find ourselves getting trapped in pointless semantical arguments, or finding ourselves talking with people about philosophy but not actually understanding the words that we're using, understanding the ideas that we're throwing against each other. We're not going to get any ground unless we can set that base. And that base is actually understanding the source material. And it's understanding what some of the applications are and what we can do with it. So one of the things I want to announce that I'm going to be doing over the next few episodes, there's going to be quite a few episodes focused in on this, because I do consider this something near and dear to me that I would like to see people expand on and people come to understand a little bit further. What I want to see and what I'm going to push on here is a series of episodes where I'm going to sit down with different guests, people who are very familiar with a particular philosopher, and we're just going to dive right into their work, what they actually argued for, what the basis of their arguments were, what some of the applications of their ideas can be, and the most important aspect, some of the selected readings are things that you as the person in the audience, or just a person that might be generally curious, can make a point of going and looking up and learning and understanding a little bit better. If there's any point or purpose to any of the articles that I write, or to this podcast, or frankly any of the media that's libertarian oriented or philosophy or political or economic or anything like that, that you might absorb, it's hopefully to gather more knowledge. And the gathering of knowledge, well, it's a useful pursuit in and of itself. It's most effective when you have some practicalities and some ways to implement it. So I'm hoping that with the help of a couple of selected guests over the next few weeks, which I suppose with the amount of people that I'm hoping to talk to might be the next few months, probably 8 or 12, or hopefully more if it turns out to be something that members of the audience do enjoy and want to learn more about, which I do hope you do. I'm going to be diving through it with these guests, and hopefully we can walk away from it with some more information and ways to implement it and use it. So, just to wrap everything up, as I mentioned before, you can listen to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts, including the new Curious Task podcast, which would be on a different RSS feed, so you do have to search that one out. First episode is out now, and again, it's done by Vinnie Marshall, who will be one of the guests that will be coming back. If those of you know him can probably figure out who he's going to talk about, but just in case you don't, I'm going to leave that under wraps. You can follow us on all forms of social media, myself included, specifically on Facebook, just by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And again, another thank you to everyone that's out there for coming up to almost 800 follows around the time that this episode will air. So definitely thank you for that. And if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.